My guest today is Dave DeMott, president of Gridiron Insurance, an underwriting organization selling a variety of insurance products in Florida, and also president-elect of the Florida Surplus Lines Association and chair of its legislative committee. Dave is here today to help us understand what it is really like on the front lines of the wacky in Florida insurance market. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Dave.
So the first question is, in my conversations with Joe Petrelli with DeMott's and Mark Friedlander of the Insurance Information Institute, they complained about rampant fraud in Florida. Neither of them sell insurance, however, so their information is really anecdotal. You do sell insurance and actually do manage insurance claims and insureds. What are they talking about?
Big question. Where to start? It's certainly a question with some history behind it, and we jokingly like to say that it's fraud in a really, really, really nice dress or a really, really fancy suit, if you prefer. But it's certainly very multi-layered and kind of different than what your traditional thought of fraud would be in the insurance marketplace. You know, everyone thinks about fraud, and you kind of think of somebody with a thing of kerosene and a pack of matches at
Sure.
2 a.m. This is certainly a very, very different type of fraud. I think it's easy to illustrate it through a simplistic example and then kind of take a deeper dive into the wormhole.
Okay.
I think a basic understanding of the complexity kind of allows you to kind of create a bigger picture. Florida has had some recent legislative changes, but I'll kind of go back to circa 19 and 20, right before COVID. Florida has a one-way attorney's fee statute, and it also has an assignment of benefits capability, which has been somewhat ratified through the courts. And what that means is essentially, say you have a bunch of damage to your property, or a leaky faucet or something like that, you can assign a portion and/or all the benefits of your policy to the remediation contractor, who will come in and do the work.
Okay.
So it's
that
designed
means that
to be.
they get the value of the claim. So when you say assignment, you're saying assignment. What do the words assignment and the word benefit mean?
So essentially what they're saying is they're coming in to do the work, so I would just prefer the carrier for you to work with them and pay them so they can take care of the damage and repair everything. Okay.
Right.
So the interesting thing about this is, as you think about everything that I'll go through, there is a kind of consumer protection element that was the design of all these items.
Yep.
But then when you really unravel them, you're going to see that it was kind of consumer protectionism that was basically taken and run 1,000 yards through the end zone and back through 18 different end zones. And that's kind of where you end this story. Essentially, if you take that example that I just gave, it's the simplest way to do it. So before we even get to the roof, because the roof and roof deck cladding and those suits becomes a whole nother iteration of this same discussion. So essentially, let's say you have this damage. You had a roof. You had a leaky faucet. There's damage, all over the place. You assign benefit to the contractor. Contractor comes in and says, this is going to be, $40K to fix. And then the company comes out adjusted and says, absolutely not. This is $20K to fix. The remediation contractor will then, and sometimes it works vice versa as well, will then say, well, I'm going to go out, and my buddy Rick is a public adjuster. Let me get Rick to look at this. He can look at this and give you another view and potentially negotiate this better for the company. Now, important, as soon as this has now happened, now you have two different things going on. One, you have a public adjuster who will now take a percentage of your proceeds, okay, based on what the final amount is, okay? And then you also have your benefit that's been subsequently assigned to this remediation contractor, who is somewhat loosely incentivized, at least economically, to kind of hit the pedal a little bit on what the overall damages are on this claim. Okay, so let's stick with these same numbers. Let's say company, or let's say they say 40. Company says, we've got two quotes, we think it's 20. Public adjuster comes in and says, absolutely not, I actually think it's closer to 50. Okay, so Company says there's no way it's 40 or 50. We're happy to negotiate in good faith and come up and work with you guys, but we don't think it's 40 or 50. We've got a lot of documentation to say it's not 40 or 50. This is what we have as a scope of work. Okay. At this point, the public adjuster and the remediation contractor say, well, this doesn't really make sense. Let's involve our second cousin, Bob, who's an attorney, and Bob is going to file a lawsuit because we don't think this claim has been being handled properly or fairly. Okay, so the one-way attorney's fee statutes, which I highly encourage everyone to look at, 627428. There's been some revisions to it, and again, so I'm talking about kind of the old days now. Essentially, what that said, and it was kind of a throwback to bad faith claims handling. So in other words, the thought process was this is in statute because you have damage for $10K. The carrier refuses to pay it, ignores you, doesn't respond to anything. You have to go out and get an attorney, and subsequently they're awarded fees. So again, the thought process behind this was somewhat of a consumer protectionist thought process on helping folks for really, really unfair predatory claims practices, which I think, generally speaking, most folks could loosely understand. But going back to our example, so now all of a sudden, lawsuit comes in, unfair claims handling practices, bing, bang, boom, an entire lawsuit. And so what ends up happening is if more than $1 is awarded over what their tender was, in this case the $20K, then that attorney will get 100% of his fees paid back, subject to a multiplier. So what a lodestar fee multiplier is if they're taking the job on contingency, they charge, let's say, $20K for the work, then they get an amplification of that. So you could get them running the meter on the claim plus the lodestar fee multiplier, and what should have been $20K of attorney's fees ends up being $75K. So if you run my example all the way out, now let's take a look at what's happened in the Florida market times thousands and thousands of claims. So it should have been a $20K claim that the carrier eventually ends up, say, settling for $25K. Okay. Now all of a sudden you have roughly 10% of that fee is going to go to the public adjuster. Okay. So let's call that $2,500 to $3,000 right off the top. Okay. The homeowner's still going to end up with that 20 to 22K, which a good chunk and or all of it will go to the remediation and remediation contractor. And then at the same time, the carrier is going to get a bill for the one-way attorney's fee statute back from the lawyer from this entire claims activity. So what does that mean? Think about these numbers in mass. A reasonably $20K claim is now going to end up being $25K on the indemnity side and circa $70 to $75K of lawyer's fees. So now you have a $20K claim that's dragged on for a year and change and ended up being roughly $100,000.
Amazing.
And this is a very, very, very simplistic example. When you start thinking about complex losses, think about how the math would change.
So the remediation contractor who gets assigned the claim, if that was all that happened, they would still be able to negotiate a higher settlement than a consumer would? So the assignment of benefits alone, I'm trying to isolating the different components here. So the assignment of benefits, that's the first thing. That how much
the answer to your question is a little bit is straightforward. The answer to your question is if the remediation contractor comes in and says it's $20K and the carrier comes out and says we think it's 15, 9 times out of 10, again 9 times out of 10, if we all spend time digging around, you're going to find this crazy example. 9 times out of 10, the insurance adjuster will work with the remediation contractor and say, we think it's 15. You guys think it's 20. Tell you what, we'll give you a check for indemnity for 18. Is that agreeable? And we'll split the difference, or we'll find some central. And generally speaking, the work should go on. If you go to places like Texas and other areas, this is the way it happens every single day.
Okay.
In Florida. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, maybe you're going to make the point. In Florida, something is different about this process. It becomes more predatory. I mean, without the lawyers yet. So before we touch the lawyers, is there some problem with this process as it's being kind of used or implemented?
Well, I mean, David, you're almost putting the cart before the horse here. And the reason is, we haven't even gotten to this. Everyone, I think, listeners can probably understand loosely what's happening here. The issue is, think about this. and then think about really aggressive packs of remediation contractors, PAs, and lawyers working in conjunction with each other that are marketing, soliciting door to door, and actively patrolling neighborhoods and patterns and patterns and swaths of homes. And if you want a stat, I know this has been thrown around a ton, but 8% of the premium in the industry in the U.S. marketplace is Florida homeowners. 72% of all litigation is Florida homeowners.
Yeah.
8 and 72. You don't need a ton of math degrees to realize that something's broken.
So yeah, that litigation side of things, I mean, that's going to be obviously lawyers. I remember hearing before I ever heard of one-way attorney's fees, and I'm interested to know kind of what your take is on the reforms. But let's take the kind of the simplistic example there. If the lawyer gets $1 more of payment, then they get all of their fees paid by the insurance company, plus, as you say, some kind of multiplier, which is kind of incredible. That I can kind of understand in principle, right? Because, if the lawyer getting a percentage basis and they only get $1 more, it's not really worth it for them to fight on behalf of the customers. So, how do you incentivize them? Well, you got to get the insurance company to pay for kind of all its malfeasance of undercutting people. But, just even keeping that out with the assignment of benefits of the claims, I've heard that has also on its own been a problem. Is that maybe because that's the roofers as opposed to the the running faucet? Is maybe the specifics of the example make that kind of more or identify a situation where that's more of a problem?
Well, the problem with the AOB is when you break it down into steps, is the AOB is really the first step. Yeah. Before you run down the rest of that equation, it all starts with the AOB and then it starts working laterally. So I think that's why AOB by itself. Again, think of this all as broken down into different individual items. AOB, the design in AOB is, the toilet overflowed in the middle of the night. I need someone to come pull out some drywall, dry out the house before damage gets way worse. And the carrier in good faith should pay whatever this basic, remediation and or potential reduction in damages that they'll provide. So in good faith, a small provisioning of AOB is logical. I know there's folks in the industry that would probably gasp when I say that. The problem is that it's a principle that was somewhat logical that has now been, again, sprinted to the end zone and back out. Yeah. And so again, it was designed for some degree of basic consumer protectionism. And it was kind of liberalized through the courts through a few different judgments and protections of AOB in law. And that subsequently really kind of served to almost galvanize the practice that I've just gone through in great detail.
So it seems to me that there's an incentive for the contractor to inflate the job, because if they can, they're always trying to get more money. But if the customer isn't the one who has to pay the contractor and the insurance company is, their insurance company is probably at an information disadvantage relative to the customer on what it really looks like. They're not there, and so the contractor can manipulate the insurance company into a larger payout.
There's an important point there, David, and I'm glad you brought up, because I kind of glossed over it because I was trying to keep it real simple. Part of the other problem with AOB is by the time the company adjuster turns up to adjust the claim, the remediation contractor is already on site and has already begun performing some work.
Oh, really?
So you have some degree of, I don't want to say prejudice because I think it's the wrong word. And I also think it's important to note that what I don't want to do is get caught in kind of a sweeping generalization. I think there are PAs that do a good job, and I think there are remediation contractors out there that do a great job. Obviously from where I sit positionally, I've seen some of the work that's been great. Mm-hmm. And just like that, I think there's also some folks that have been, in my mind, somewhat predatory.
Yeah. So contractor can show up, start the work, and then the insurance company comes along, and they have a hard time seeing what it was that the original problem was, right?
Think about it like this, David, and then you can move on. We have seen this. Think about your carrier. You're an insurance company in the state of Florida. The first you hear about the loss, the very first time you hear about the loss, you get the notice of loss to your claims team. There's a notice of loss written by the insurance agent. There's an assigned AOB, a public adjuster's contract, and a notice of intent to sue all together at once at first loss.
Okay, right. Bundle. Can you tell me kind of like, protect the innocent and guilty, I guess, but tell me like a specific story about a claim that you were a part of, and you can pick a roofing claim if that's a way to kind of introduce that topic, or anything you like, about kind of how it started, what you saw, did it go wrong? Probably would go wrong.
I mean, I think the easiest one to look at is really the roof decking.
Okay.
So Florida has a statute that was recently changed in 22. By the way, that's why I keep shaping some of these, because there has been recent amendments and changes that in a positive fashion to a lot of what we're discussing right now. Then what the overall effect of that is, we could probably cover that later in the chat. But easiest way to think about this is, let's say a really, really bad thunderstorm comes through in, Tampa in the middle of the day, really, really, 40-mile-an-hour winds, lightning, thunder, just all this kind of stuff. Tree branch falls on the corner of the roof. Maybe you lose a shingle or two. Maybe the roof's 20 years old, so you already had some leaks. Now there's more leaks. Take your pick. Think of this all like, in a real world environment. Well, Florida, until last year's legislation, had a provision in it where if the roof was constructively more than 25% damaged, then you must replace the roof. So take the initial example that I just gave. So what happens in this case? Take out the water damage from the leaky toilet or faucet. Sorry, I can't remember exactly what the example was. And now talk about a roof that's, say, 20% damaged. Now change the remediation contractor to a roofing contractor. Do you not think that they're going to do everything they can to get the roofing damage over that 25% quotient, so now they can do a complete re-roof?
Yeah.
So that is a classic example of what you'll see. And if you want to do some individual kind of study, go look at Irma. Like Hurricane Irma, I think I read this stat, and I think someone on the reinsurance side gave it to me, that Irma, with reopenings and openings, initial openings of claims and reopenings, had more claims than any storm in U.S. history. Think about that. Yeah. And the reason is it was rampant abuse of the 25% threshold in conjunction with PAs and everything that I've elaborated in the first instance.
I do want to try and drill into some specific experiences that you've had, if we can. And when I mean in the story, I mean conjure up in your mind an actual instance and kind of walk us through with the detail. And I'll ask you about some detail if you can, because I really want to know what it's like actually when somebody files a claim, what happens.
Well, I think it's easier, and sorry, I was trying to kind of give you another proxy of what these claims look like, and you could kind of go example by example and kind of draw some parallel to either example that I've given. I think it's before we get to an exact example, I think one of the things that you want to talk about is really how aggressive the public adjusters are. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I'm fortunate enough to live in Broward County. We really have not had a direct hit from a storm since circa Wilma. I think we've been glanced a couple of times, but really nothing of what I would call material convective wind field note, over 80 miles an hour, that sort of stuff. I can tell you that I still get calls, texts, and PAs that knock on my door soliciting to go up on the roof, and that they promise me that they can get money from my carrier.
Really?
So that's just me. And I mean, I got a text last week.
Will it work, do you think?
I think it's harder for them to do it now than it was. Again,
right.
Going back to that 1920 threshold. But the data from the carriers and the insolvency, and when you look at the loss adjustment expense ratio on some of these folks, the answer simply to your question is follow the data. Yes.
Yeah.
I will say, I'm unabashed about telling them that they're committing fraud and that I'm going to report them and that they need to find something else to do.
Yeah.
But that's obviously someone in the industry. But the interesting thing about this, Dave, and the reason I bring it up is because I could walk around my office and ask them, how many of you that own a home have gotten either a letter, a phone call, anything from a PA, and almost all of them we'll say yes,
Right.
times 2, times 3, times 4.
Prospecting.
So yeah, so I think that's an element that has to be discussed. And I think the legislature is doing their best. I think they tried to put some curtailing in that behavior, and there was a subsequent case which basically said that it's kind of their version of marketing, and in theory you're obstructing their kind of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, their commercial interests. And I think there's going to continue to be regulatory efforts to try to curtail that kind of what I would call to some degree predatory behavior. Great examples, though. So you want some examples. A lot of the examples that I like to use are kind of what I like to call low level storm sort
Brilliant.
of
Yeah.
sort of
So
examples.
not Ian, something else.
Correct. Yeah, I think that's an important differentiation here, David. I think everybody, I'm sure there's a certain amount that's listening to this going, oh, is this just carriers that have behaved badly, and did some of them deserve this? I would say the industry's pretty good. It doesn't mean that there's not one or two folks out there that could have handled claims better. Maybe they were overwhelmed with claims. Take your pick. But I can tell you, in Cat 5 stuff like Ian, when somebody doesn't have a roof, and I think, being a Floridian, lived my whole life here, I think certainly more often than not, carriers have behaved, on the front foot on this stuff. That being said, some examples we've seen. One of the things that I've seen is, so you get either your afternoon storm, or you get the hurricane glance where the person's max wind field was maybe 30 miles an hour, and then you get a claim for essentially what is a super duper old roof. In some cases we had one where basically the screen and the patio was pretty much already falling apart. This thing got 30-mile-an-hour winds. It ripped what was half of the screen down. They got a PA. They got a attorney, said that the screen was attached to the roof superstructure, and so now they've got to redo a portion of the roof. They've got to redo the entire aluminum superstructure. It tore up a piece of the concrete, so they have to redo the patio, and they think the pool's got issues now because of it. And do you see how things like this, like they tend to, I think,
And did that work?
Conflate.
Did that one work? What did they get at the end? Do you remember? Do you know?
It's a really good question. I think on that one, that the issue with this one, why I think that was so conflated, was because this individual account had a really large wind hail deductible, so they were trying to conflate the damage to go up and up and up and up and over
Right.
over the wind hail deductible. So I think the wind hail deductible ended up holding. I think we paid a small sum over the wind hail deductible, and it didn't end up being litigated because at the end of the day, the number was so small that there wasn't really much to be gained either way.
Yeah.
So
it wasn't
but
worth their
either
time
way,
then. Like that whole, like, the crew probably didn't come out of that one happy.
or they had other instances which they had much more gas
Sure.
on, which they thought were going to have big returns than that one. I mean, take your pick.
Right. Okay. Got another story? I like that. Good.
Yeah, I mean the water damage one is like kind of almost like famous out of Miami-Dade County.
Yeah, I've heard this about Miami. Yeah. The water damage. is
Yeah,
bad.
a lot of it is we've seen it. Leaky pipes in the kitchen. They get a PA. We've actually seen some where the homeowner after didn't realize he was signing an AOB, and the PA basically said, if you just follow like what I'm going to do here, you're going to be able to get a whole new kitchen on this rather than just a whole new island area. So after the fact, you kind of end up hearing from the claims adjusters on our side when they sit down and explain to them the mechanism and how they're doing all this. A lot of folks actually get pretty upset because they feel like they've been kind of hosed and put into a sausage grinder a little bit with how this process works from the PA and one-way attorney's fee side. So we've seen a ton of that kind of small activity. The leaky roof one is another really good. We've seen a load of those. Florida, your useful life on a roof is really, if you get 20 to 24 years, you've done really, really well. That roof was put on really well. Extreme heat, a lot of rain, some degree of convective activity through hurricanes, severe storms. So you get a lot of folks where there's an older leaky roof, and they get solicited by a PA, and the PA goes up and takes a look at the roof and says, "Oh yeah, you've got damage to this ridge line, and this was probably from this storm, and yeah, let's submit something and see and see if we can get the carrier involved. So a lot of those, I hate to use a phrase, but they're kind of a little bit phishing claims. It's an older roof that just needs to be proactively replaced by a homeowner, as opposed to something that's got genuine first party real damage.
How do they find?
Really, every example that I just gave you has happened to us 3-4 times over minimum.
So how do they find these? How do you know a roof is old, right? I mean, do the roofing contractors or the adjusters, do they have a way of, I don't know, do they fly drones over these houses, or what do they do? How do they prospect?
So this is where I'm going to go a little bit kind of off the rails, because I try not to, at the end of the day, I'm running a business.
Yeah.
What I've heard from my fellows in the industry, and there is some data behind it, is that they tend to work in neighborhoods. So okay. they think if one homeowner they're real successful for, he'll talk to another homeowner, and then they'll hit that entire sector of the neighborhood, or that like greater like neighborhood area.
Mm-hmm. And what they're doing is they're knocking on doors saying, I can get you a new roof. Is that what they do?
They're knocking on doors, or they're counting on word of mouth, or they're using there's a lot of it's text now. Yeah, all of it. All of it together.
I mean, they're enticing these customers, right? Somehow they're promising them money. They must be, right? Or new stuff, I guess, from the insurance companies.
I would say they're fairly careful there, because it's phrasing like, why don't you let us come up and take a look at your roof, and we'll see what we can do for you. We might be able to get you a new roof. That's not a promise.
Yep.
That's a, hey, let us take a look, right?
Right. Okay. So I have, I'll say that I'm struck by how this stuff it could be benign, right? If these people just weren't around to abuse these laws and these regulations that are, as we've pointed out, like in principle, like in theory anyway, not a problem. What are we doing, or what is happening in Florida, kind of like to try and fix this? You mentioned there's some efforts this year. I forget who it was said that they passed some laws last year, which weren't as effective. What's the strategy?
Well, that's a great question. Let me give you a couple stats, and then we'll move to the question, just because I think it's really interesting. So in preparation for this, I really just want to take a look at some numbers, and I looked at some of the carrier numbers. Obviously, Florida's had some insolvencies. What I was in particular looking at was it was hard to extrapolate perfectly, David, so I'm gonna use some leeway here, but essentially what I want to look at is the separation between indemnity payments and ALAE, which is actual loss adjustment expenses. So that would be the portion you pay to adjust the claim, pay lawyers, all that sort of stuff. And essentially what I found over the better part of the last 3 years is that ALAE was roughly 33% of the claims total for any one of these carriers.
Yep.
Now, if you need a rough barometer, ALAE from our side, it's rare that I see it over 10%. Rare. I mean, really rare. So while 33% someone may think isn't a big number, it is a massive, massive number. And that's just me doing a quick column eyeball, not going through it in great detail.
Yeah.
The other thing, so you look at insurance-related lawsuits in the state of Florida between 2014 to 2021, they've increased 400% from 16,000 to over almost 77,000. So really just a massive increase in those figures. One of the other things that I think is interesting in the data when you look at it, and you can go on Case Glide and kind of work this backwards, is there's essentially 20 law firms around the state that handle almost 55% of the caseload on this statewide, which kind of tells you that there is some degree of predatory behavior here. Mm-hmm. But sorry.
Yeah, but so a lot. I mean, to me, there's a specialization component, right? To people just like running a business on this, and that's possible. In my, if I think about like what is the distinct about Florida, one thing that's distinct about Florida is that it's like sticking out in the ocean and has a huge amount of coastline and massively exposed to hurricanes and gets a lot of activity, and so you have a bigger industry of people who service this stuff. and they need
Sure.
something to do when the wind doesn't blow, and so they go around trying to generate business by walking the line a little bit or crossing the line. In some cases, you're going to have some percentage of them that will do that because this is a way to make a buck for them. Is that does that sound right? Is that kind of what's going on? Is it just like an inherent problem in Florida? It's going to be a bigger industry, and so they're just going to be better at extracting money from insurance companies, and you need actually more protection for insurance companies as a result in a place like that?
I think the answer is I think the answer is complicated. I don't think it's as simplified as you potentially made it, David.
Okay.
I think there's I think if you listen to this data, I think it's pretty compelling that the market is rife with abuse.
I agree with that. I agree that it's rife with abuse, but I'm wondering, why is it rife with abuse? Like, why is there abuse in Florida when you have equivalent laws elsewhere and you don't have the abuse?
Well, I don't think that's functionally accurate. I don't think you have as equivalent laws.
Okay.
Why
do you have the laws then?
Florida.
So why are the laws in Florida
Yeah.
different? That's like, there's a cause for all this. Something's going on, right? Like, what is it?
Well, I think you've got some statutes which were designed initially for consumer protectionism.
Yeah.
And I think you've had some subsequent judgments that have liberalized some of these consumer protectionisms, which have then kind of cracked the window open and people continue to pile through the window.
Yeah.
And I think the simple answer is carriers in the state of Florida do need protection, should be afforded equal protection to pursue their economic interest and to adjust claims fairly. And I think right now the market is set up in such a way that it's almost a loaded deck against the carriers. And the shameful thing is, legitimate claims truly legitimate claims get kind of washed up in this mess as well. But I think the answer is, like, if you look at Texas has the same amount of weather standards, has tighter statutes and legislative codes, and they don't have these issues around roof decking and fraud, and they don't have they have a one-way attorney's fee statute, but the threshold is mega. I mean, you have to climb 18 ladders, and you have to truly have behaved in horrible faith to activate that statute. Whereas I think the bar in this is way too low. But you asked before about some of the legislative fixes. Listen, I think from a government perspective, folks know that this is an issue. I don't think it's an issue that they're not aware of. To get anything passed in the state of Florida, it's going to take 3 yeses. It's going to take the governor's office, it's going to take the Speaker of the House, and it's going to take the Senate President. And the truth of the matter is, while this issue has been complex, it necessarily has not been able to get all 3 yeses until the 22 session, which had some real reforms to the one-way fee statute, which they created a kind of a stair step based on damages. They put a provision there that you have to file an intent to file a lawsuit and give the company 30 days to cure whatever deficiency there is. There's a couple other things too. I don't want to jump through all of them, but
when did those go into place? When did those get enacted?
July.
Okay. So we're going to see how they do, I guess, with Hurricane Ian striking in October.
Well, here's the problem with that. We've already had seven companies go under in the state, and you've had nothing but red ink, pretty much from a combined ratio perspective over the last 5 years. You do end up in this area, David, where you're saying, is it too little, too late? Yeah. Well, and I think that's, by the way, that's where we are. If I'm going to ask the question and answer it.
Yeah. Well, we'll something's better than nothing. You got to start somewhere. There's all sorts of metaphors we can trade on that. I think that if there's a real will to improve the problem and the problem doesn't change, then that will simply wasn't realized, and so it's going to keep going, right? At least the trend is positive, right? There's hope here, because that's the first little bit of hope that I've heard in a few of these conversations, and I have a couple more, that actually, it seems like the political climate in Florida is recognizing that this is a problem, and it's pursuing it.
Listen, I would absolutely say I'm massively bullish on this market, and and the folks that are elected officials in the state of Florida right now.
Okay.
I think we'll see more meaningful tort reform. There's going to be a special session in December. The legislature will reconvene in March. I believe the folks in all chambers understand this problem and what it means to the long-term effects of the state of Florida. You have to think about this from an economic perspective. If folks can't find insurance and Citizens balloons out of control, that's basically the state of Florida holding risk on their balance sheet. You're talking about real estate closings slowing down. You're talking about lack of availability et al. Across the entire state. So I believe the stakeholders and the legislators on the side completely understand this issue. I've had the benefit of interacting with some of them, and I'm massively bullish on them getting a hold of this and making real meaningful reform. Now, whether that means returning the reform, completely reforming the one-way attorney's fee statute or additional changes. And again, I think there has been a solid effort to attempt to change some of these, but I will say a lot of the changes over the last few years, they needed to go this far and they kind of went this far, and so that's why it's kind of been the window shutting as opposed to the window shut. And I think what we're going to see in December and into next year is kind of a clink to that window.
How about non-property? I mean, maybe you just do property. I'm not sure, but I get the sense that there's problems in the auto space as well, and maybe others. Is that right? Do you know?
Yeah. So in particular, auto glass. It's not my biggest area of proficiency, but I know that kind of auto glass and auto glass repair has been an area that's had a fair amount of fraud. I know PIP has had its issues with fraud. If you're going to go deeper on the liability section, letters of protection for folks that are injured in personal injury cases. That's an area where the state needs some reform. I think there's been a lot of good work behind the scenes done on that by some of the not think tanks, but some of the kind of tort reform hawks and groups throughout the state.
Lobbyists.
So they're all.
We can call them.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's not
Okay.
just there also is judicial reform coalitions and tort reform coalitions. I've had the benefit of working with a few of them that are really, really good. But I think there's some issues. There's some work to be done on that front. But if you're going to talk about the kind of upfront, most pervasive issue that's got to get fixed, the homeowner side is kind of the one that kind of stares you straight in the face. But there is other work to be done in the state as well. David, it's a good question.
I mean, it's such a tremendous irony to me that in Florida you have this state let's call it individualistic, and you have laws that are designed to protect individuals. And then what happens is you have a experts springing up all over the place to take those advantages, which they probably don't need, over the insurance carriers and abuse them and exploit them and turn them into a real big problem. And insurance carriers are just pass-through economic institutions. Like, all they're doing is taking the amount of premium they get, they're paying it back to people in the form of claims. And if the claims numbers goes up, the premium numbers are going to go up. And they're not doing anything special behind the scenes other than giving the money back to Floridians. And so if they're extracting more in claims, they're going to have to pay more in premium. It's unfortunately, over the long term, it's pretty simple math. And the more you protect consumers against those institutions, that means the more that they take out of them and the more they have to pay in. It is tremendously interesting to me that the instinct of protecting consumers has totally backfired in Florida.
Again, I think it's well intentioned, but if you take any consumer protection item and then you either liberalize it through some bad judgments and or expansion of these could be slight tweaks to code that open doors. So this is not, I would very much stop short at saying this is your fault and period, full stop. I would say, I think the trial bar does a lot of lobbying on the behalf of this topic. I'll stop short there. But at the end of the day, this whole thing, all these examples, and a lobbyist I'm quite close with made this remark. It's essentially transfer of wealth. It's not indemnity, it's not insurance, it's use of statute for transfer of wealth. And I think it's taken long enough, but I think the folks that run our state are now fully aware of it.
Transferring wealth to the service providers, the lawyers probably.
Correct.
Mostly, from
Correct.
insurance companies' premium payments into lawyers' pockets. Okay, so we'll close on this, David. How can people help with this? Tell me about, I mean, we're not done yet, probably. So, what can folks do to help Floridians?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is relatively simple. One, don't engage with third parties. I think the governor and the CFO of our state have done a really good job, especially post Ian, saying, folks, work with your carriers in good faith. I can tell you, I think they're going to give you fair offers and really work to indemnify you quickly. I think there is a place for third parties where there's genuine malice in claims. Not on every single claim. So I would say first and foremost, work with your carriers in good faith if you have a legitimate loss. Two would be to really engage with to not engage in some of this hey, come and let me come out and take a look at your roof, and I think I can find something. I think if we just stop rewarding that behavior to some extent, I think it'll go away to some extent. And I'd also say, if you get a chance, or if you're friendly or with an elected official, just comment to them. Some of the premiums where they are now, they've 100% gone to this level because of this predatory behavior. And I think the more folks that are talking about that, overall, the better.
Great. So Dave, anything you want to how do people get to know you if they want to work with you or do something with you? What's your tell us where to find you online or elsewhere.
So we're a program manager. You can check us out at gridirons.com. We work with a combination between wholesalers and some local retailers. Throughout the country, and we've got products that work in various states. I did want to give a quick remark. One thing about the state, in particular in Florida, is our surplus line sector has done a really good job of being kind of alive and vibrant and taking up a lot of the risk as carriers have left the state. So I think that's one section I did want to work in, as far as not just the gridiron front, but just in general. I think that sector of the industry has done a really good job of kind of being the safety valve for the industry and really being there as the state challenges with either new exposures, high capacity risks, some of the issues we've talked about today. But overall, the surplus lines market has been really truly strong and vibrant, and done a lot for the state. And as someone that sits in that association, I have to put in a plug from an advocacy perspective, David. So I hope you don't mind.
Yep, more important than ever. My guest today is Dave DeMott. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.